So, as many of you know, Pokemon Go is a mobile game developed by Niantic released in 2016 with a gameplay element built around going places in the real world. Also, as many of you know, the last year was not conducive to that type of gameplay mechanic. In response to the pandemic, Niantic made some quality of life changes to the game as a temporary measure to allow the game to continue to be played in a stay-at-home environment, chief among these changes being the decision to increase the range of players being able to interact with the item distribution locations called Pokestops from 40 meters to 80 meters. However, as of August 1st, 2021, Niantic has chosen to go ahead and reverse the changes back to their original state. This reversion has many fans of the game upset due to an understandable lack of understanding of the reasoning behind it. My goal today is to examine the situation and the potential reasoning behind the recent design decisions in Pokemon Go in order to spur some deeper critical thinking, but not to make any calls about whether it's the right thing to do or not, regardless of any benefits or hindrances. If this was in fact as simple of a matter as many seem to think it is, then realistically it would be resolved already. First, I want to introduce the core principles of game design, not in a gameplay sense, but in the reasoning of why developers make games. The question to ask here is, why does a game exist? All games fundamentally provide the player with a way to spend time in an entertaining or rewarding way, but from the developer side of things, a game is created for two reasons: to make money and to create said fun and or rewarding experience, usually in a novel way. Each game will vary on how much either of these design principles weighs on its development. Games like the Mario and Zelda franchises, as well as many indie games, focus on creating a novel gaming experience and make money as a result of doing something fun and unique. On the other side of things are games that were specifically made to bring in a lot of money, common with many mobile games, ongoing development or release games, and games with infinitely repurchasable resources like loot boxes. As per my examples, Pokemon Go seems to fall into both categories. The gameplay of roaming the real world to interact with digital entities is highly unique to Niantic's gaming library, but it's also an ongoing development title with infinitely repurchasable in-game Pokecoins using real-world currency. But these observations are on the release state of the game and don't answer the question, why was it made, and which principle primarily drove its creation. Based on the development cycle of the game, the handling of features, and the responses to community feedback, most players tend to assume the core creation principle is increasing revenue, and yet the game would likely be just another Pokemon spin-off like Pokemon Duel or Magikarp Jump without the mechanic that made it so novel. With that, it's important to consider that the mechanic of real-world exploration connected to the mobile game interaction existed with Niantic's game Ingress prior to Pokemon Go. A lot of my further discussion will follow the assumption that Pokemon Go is primarily designed to generate revenue while touching on mechanics, as there are more revenue-based design criterion to consider. Regardless of how it was made, let's discuss its upkeep and how games address player concern under these two principles. For a game that strives to be a fun experience for players first and foremost, responding to player feedback and making requested changes is almost a no-brainer, but still requires care to not unbalance or derail the mechanics of the game. But when a design is focused on revenue, managing the game is practically a game in of itself, where the goal is to maximize a number regardless of the existence of other stats, only considering how they affect the main number. First, let's consider how Niantic makes money through Pokemon Go. Firstly, through players buying Pokecoins and other things, and second, through sponsored ads in the form of Pokestops. They may also generate revenue off of data collected from users, though I've only seen this discussed and not the actual data, but I will be considering it as a possible factor when breaking down design decisions. With these bases established, let's consider how each source of revenue generates such. From players, this will be through one-time purchases of ticketed events, but mainly through the purchase of the game's Pokecoins, and more specifically from the small percentage of players who spend a lot, often referred to as whales. From sponsors, this will be through the sponsor paying Niantic to turn their location into a Pokestop type location in the game in order to draw players to the location and increase foot traffic. Though let me be clear that I do not know how much sponsors pay Niantic for this. Same thing for the data collection. If they do sell data about players, I don't know what they would make for it. With these revenue sources in mind, let's consider the costs of development that can affect them. As before, I don't have any specific numbers, so this will simply be a list of cost considerations regarding making changes to the game. First is the cost of resources for design. This will be the cost of the game's development and upkeep, as well as costs for additional help if the developers need to add something the current team is ill-equipped to create themselves. These costs are unavoidable, but generally low when compared to the rest of the costs on this list, and a game as big and successful as Pokemon Go should have no problem covering them. So next is the cost of satisfying complaints from the player base. The cost will either be that to make the requested changes, or come in the form of lost revenue from unhappy players dropping or not buying the game. If players leaving are free-to-play players who don't spend, or players who spend lightly, it's possible the cost of a change may be greater than the loss in revenue from departing players. Then there are the costs associated with sponsors. If a game design creates statistics that are appealing, a game will attract and possibly keep sponsors. With that is the cost of implementing the sponsored content into the game. However, if a game makes changes that no longer appease sponsors or alter the statistics that they no longer meet the promised specs, sponsors may drop the game, creating the cost of sponsored revenue loss. Then, if it's a factor, there's the cost associated with data collection. This one is hard to pin down, but as each player likely provides the same data, they're probably all weighed equally regardless of spending on Pokecoins. Playtime may be more of a factor, but big impacts to this cost will only come if a large portion of the player base leaves the game. So with these driving factors behind game design decision making in mind, let's look at how players are responding to the changes. Firstly, as a developer myself, I think it's important to remember that video games are a pure commodity, and that they are not a requirement for life. Developers have the sole right to develop the game as they like, and unless we as players specifically invested in or paid the developers for a specific design criterion or gameplay element, we are not entitled to the game as we design it, and get the game as the developers release it. With that in mind, players do have the right to give feedback, and it's important for developers to be open to said feedback. If players do not like the game will not sell or generate revenue, as players also retain the right to not be players, and it's my understanding that a lot of players are dropping Pokemon Go or striking the monetary options to stress their feedback. So, good on you guys. If Pokemon Go's primary principle is its monetization and the costs of not appeasing players is otherwise low, this is likely the optimal way to inspire change. So now I want to break down a few aspects of Pokemon Go for further discussion, specifically regarding the change to the Pokestop interaction radius and the design considerations that may be driving it. As players, the decision to reduce the radius back seems purely detrimental to the gameplay for reasons of safety, accessibility, and respect as outlined in a recent letter to Niantic, as well as the general convenience of not having to alter your walking route in order to nab Pokestops along the way. So the question all players are asking is, why revert the change? Top theories point to monetization, but then the question becomes, how does reversing this quality of life change increase revenue for the game? Before looking at those possibilities, I would first like to add the admittedly weak idea that reducing the radius returns closer to the initial movement and location-based design of the game, though I myself never actually changed when or how I play the game, or how much I spend due to the radius, which is why I regard it as a weak argument. As far as the question of increasing revenue, from the player base alone, reducing the radius seems to be purely detrimental. The closest reason I can surmise for this is that the reduced distance also reduces the number of items players pick up, and items like Pokeballs can be bought with real currency, though in my own experience I have never purchased Pokeballs and only known a few people who bought a small amount, and no other Pokestop item can be purchased from the shop, so I find this reasoning weak and unlikely to be the driving decision. However, when it comes to sponsored Pokestops, there are a few more considerations that may affect costs and revenue more significantly. Firstly, let's consider the obvious part, that Niantic promised its sponsors increased foot traffic to sponsored locations for buying Pokestop locations in the game. Naturally, being able to interact with a Pokestop from further away would negatively impact that statistic at least a little bit. So let's consider the implications of that. First, it's just as unfair to sponsors to not get what they pay for, regardless of whether or not they're a soulless entity, as it is for players of any game to not get what they pay for. The big difference in this case being that the Pokemon Go player base merely pays for coins for items in the shop, and that's very straightforward. We don't pay for the game to have a specific criterion, and only influence it as previously stated. Niantic may also have legal obligations to fulfill their sponsorship criteria, though I have no clue how they define them beyond simply adding a Pokestop. That being said, if a company doesn't feel like their sponsored location is profiting them, they retain their right to end their sponsorship in a legal manner. With these considerations, the question of costs becomes simple. Where does Niantic stand to lose more? Players stopping spending due to design decisions, or sponsorships ending due to the inverse of those design decisions? The latest piece of this puzzle is of course Niantic's response to the community letter, creating a task force to look into the matter. It's very easy for players to see the detriment to themselves and the lack of benefit in reducing the radius, and the radius itself is just a number that seems easy to alter. But along with the previous considerations I brought up, I would like to add just a few more regarding this task force. Firstly, as a game developer, you never make a quick design decision unless you need to fix something game-breaking. Fast and unthought out decisions can have some nasty consequences down the line, and the reversion of the radius has been planned for quite some time. Second, given all the analyses I've discussed, the task force may be looking over said numbers to see the most profitable outcome, as it's possible they didn't anticipate players reacting so aggressively on the monetary front, and now they need to consider where the largest losses lie. It's also possible they're exploring the data to see if they can still give sponsors what they promised and have the radius expanded back to 80 meters. On notes other than game design and monetization, it's also possible they just don't respond to criticism well, or are not very good at design. Let me reiterate that these are all theories, please do not accept any of them as fact. Alright, that basically concludes my insight and analysis on design criteria, but I'd like to throw out my own opinions as both a game developer and a player of Pokemon Go. First and foremost is the timing of this. Even if they were going to go through with the change reversions regardless, they definitely should have waited a little longer, as we're still several months from potential return to normalcy. I can only surmise that maybe they had a legal obligation or agreement to revert the changes by now. Second, I'd also like to consider the idea of the radius never being increased in the first place. I mentioned that I dislike players who try to dictate design decisions of someone else's versus game, but I also think games should primarily be designed to be fun to play. And if you give players a taste of a quality of life feature and then yank it away, it's gonna suck. However, they did announce from the start of the changes that they plan to revert them, but they are the developers, and barring outside influence like contractual obligation, they may also choose to keep it. If they never increased the radius in the first place, I don't think we'd ever know the difference, but the reality of the matter is that they did, and it was serviceable at least for the player base. Another question to consider regarding games is, does the game have a right to ask for my money? The simple answer is yes, effort was put into making it, almost always with the expectation of selling it in exchange for that effort. The question gets a little more complicated regarding free-to-start games that offer a monetization system where you can buy resources infinitely, as unless they sell purchase-only gateway items, the game won't make any money without incentive to spend, and if it doesn't at least break even on cost, it may shut down. Beyond that, if it doesn't make as much profit as another game the devs could be working on, it may not even be monetarily worth it. The answer to this question will vary per person, as the value of what you buy in the game is different for every player. Pokemon Go has several cases to incur spending for players, including intentional design that tries patience, like the egg incubator system, lucky eggs, and star pieces, and the possibility of incurring the fear of missing out if you run out of Pokeballs but still have Pokemon to catch, as well as other beneficial optional mechanics like incense and lures. Additionally, there's the daily coin limit from gyms to guarantee all players will still retain at least some dependency on spending. But in my personal experience, if it feels like you got what you paid for and you didn't waste the money, especially in hindsight, it's probably a good spend. This has been my experience with purchases in Pokemon Go like storage upgrades, but in gacha games where you spend money on a random outcome and with Pokemon Go's egg system, it feels much less worth it. Thank you for listening to me today. I'm not trying to support or defend Niantic or the player base, but I wanted to incur some critical thinking on the matter. Everything has a reasoning behind it, and I wanted to begin the discussion of why Niantic might be making their current decisions. If you have any other theories or comments on mine, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I only ask that you be polite and respectful. And I'll see you guys next time.